Kerry here, and today I'm with Gabrielle Oriel, and Gabrielle works with she's the Senior Export Advisor, and it's for the New South Wales Government. But how lucky are you guys? She's also servicing Norfolk Island. So Gabby's going to start by telling you a little bit about the ANSOF matrix. Over to you, Gabby.
Thanks, Kerry, and welcome everyone. It's lovely to reach out to Norfolk Island. As Kerry mentioned, I'm the Export Advisor for the North Coast, so I'm employed by New South Wales State Government, but I'm contracted to provide the AusTrade services for this region. So any Australian business who has an Australian ABN number and who is looking for assistance with their export activity, they are welcome to use my services. So that's a little bit about me. So I might start off talking about export, and the question is, what is export? And my answer to that is, export is just a business strategy that you can use in your business to grow your business. There's two things that we talk about when it comes to export. The first one is export capability, and the second one is export readiness. Now, export capability we'll handle first, and that's really up to you. Export capability is about, do you have the resources to fill a demand if you create one? So do you physically have the widgets to be able to do it? Are you able to provide all the services if you increase demand for your services? Do you have the management resources to run a development program? And do you actually have the money and the cash to be able to supply the cash flow to fund growth in your business? So before we start on that area, as I said, I'll leave that to you. The next part is the export readiness. And one of the things that I wanted to show you is I use ANSOF's matrix. He was a Russian mathematician who actually developed this, but I really like it because I think it's really simple and it's easy for everyone to understand. And I want you to keep this matrix in your mind as you go along. So as you grow your business, there's only 4 real ways you can grow it. And if you sit down on a piece of paper and map out each of these 4 sections, you'll actually grow your business to the level that you want, at the speed you want, and at a cost that you can afford. So if we start with the bottom matrix, which is called the market penetration, that is where you supply existing products into your existing markets. That's fairly straightforward. In other words, you can do this in a variety of ways. You can have a sales campaign in your existing markets. You can have a price decrease. You can increase your promotion. You could actually acquire a rival in that same market, for example, or you could do some modest sort of product refinements and do a relaunch of a product. Another area that's in that matrix is called the market development, and this is really where export sits. So in the market development strategy, a business tries to expand into new markets. Now, those new markets can be a geography, like offshore. It could be New Zealand. It could be Solomon Islands. It could be Singapore. It could be China. Or it could be into other offerings. So you could do this basically by selling your existing product into different customer segments. You could go into a different area. So, for example, instead of just selling to households, you might sell into industrial buyers. Or if you're a food and beverage company, you might move beyond the retail segment and move into the food service segment. You could look for new areas or regions of a country, or you could look to foreign markets. The strategy that's most successful here typically is if the firm has a unique product technology that it can leverage. So what you really have to understand in order to expand your business in any direction is to know what's unique about it. What is your USP? And I really need you to be able to articulate that. I need you to be able to pitch that idea and have a really good understanding of what makes you unique. It also benefits from economies of scale. So the more you produce or the more you serve, It increases your output. It's also a successful strategy if the new market isn't too difficult from what you already know. So if your current business model is working really, really well where you are, and you go into a new market that can service a similar business model, you've got a higher chance of succeeding. And the other thing, of course, is to go into a market where the buyers are quite profitable. So search for a market that's got a high GDP. Okay, so that's the answer. So that's really what I want you to keep in the back of your mind, all those points that we just talked about. And now I'm going to go on to that second stage that we were talking about, and that is called the export readiness.
I've got it.
So capability, sorry?
Oh, it's on the screen now, Gabby, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. That's cool. So now we're going to go into export readiness. Now, this is something you can learn. Export capability is really in your own hands, but export readiness are all tools that you can learn, and this is definitely where we can help you. So successful exporters know that expanding into an offshore market can bring significant rewards. They should also be aware that it takes a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of commitment and money, and it doesn't necessarily always prove to be successful. So when you're a first-time exporter, or even if you're an existing exporter who is going into a different market, you might be very, very successful in New Zealand, but you might be about to go into another market, which might be Singapore. Now's the time that you test your export readiness for that particular market. And these are some of the 10 top tips that we will talk to that will help you. So when you go through these particular points, I want you to mark yes or no, and then write down some few dot points about why you answered yes or no. So number one, have you identified a potential market overseas for your product and service? That's about market selection. That is about selecting a market that will take your product, where your product is allowed to go into. For example, if you were growing blueberries, there is no market protocol into China for fresh blueberries. So it doesn't matter how much demand is in China for your fresh blueberries, you physically cannot send them because the market protocol is in place. Number two, have you estimated the market size, the strength of the competitors in your export market, and how your pricing will fit in the market? As a rule, Asian markets tend to be very price sensitive, and you've got the added costs of the freight from where you are currently or where your product is warehoused to where it will end up. So you need to understand what the size is of your market. So for example, Papua New Guinea might be a really great market, and it might be a really good market size for your product and your capability. So even though there is a far bigger market in the US of A, Papua might actually be the best market for you. And it also might have very few competitors for you in that market. The third point, do you have a product or service that is successful in the Australian market? The whole point here is to say, do you have a product that customers want? Is there demand for your product? And is it suitable for that market? If your business model works well in Australia, then that's an indicator that it might work well overseas for you. That can be particularly different for a service. For example, a service or a tourism business relies on the experience, and it relies on the actual geographic location that the service is delivered. You might be able to do a moonlight cruise with a dinner in a different market, but is that experience in that particular geographic location intrinsic to that service? So that's the question that you need to answer for yourself. Number four, will you need to modify your product or service to meet the needs of overseas customers? And that can be a whole range of things. It can be the overseas economy, it could be the buyer's needs, cultural or religious preferences, climate, seasonality, and all sorts of rules and regulations that governments may place on your product Along with IP for your product, which I would always recommend you had a good look at, and trademarking, you need to make certain that the product or the service that you are offering is allowed to be entered into the country. It could include an ingredient that is not allowed into that country. It could include a product that is dangerous and there's some rule or regulation why that product couldn't be included. Or it could be as simple as a cultural or religious offence of a product, or even the name of a product. For example, the Japanese marketing requirements are very, very different from other marketing requirements, and a more respectful image might be required if you're going to enter your product into Japan. Number 5, do you have the capacity to support new markets? That's what we talked about previously. That's the issue that we talked about in terms of production capacity, time and staffing. Number 6, and it seems a strange one, but is your management team committed to exporting? The reason this question is an indicator of your export readiness is because sometimes it's better to just develop your existing market where you are and spend more time consolidating in the Australian market than to go overseas. So that's a question that you really need to sit down with your accountant, with your business manager, with your bankers, with your mentor, with your board, and have a really good long hard discussion about. Number 7, do you have the financial resources to support the marketing, distribution and servicing of the overseas markets? And is your bank prepared to back you? Number 8, do you and your team know about export payment mechanisms such as letters of credit? The way you get paid for things overseas is very different, obviously, from where you get paid in Australia. You need to have an understanding of the prices you're going to be selling at, but also how you intend to get paid. Your bank can help you with that, but also I could help you with that if it came to that point. Some people will have 100% payment up front, and when you first send a shipment overseas on an order, I would always recommend you try and negotiate to that point. Your buyer will always push back and try and get a better deal for themselves, and they will also push out on the payment terms. But until you get to know each other, until you get a long-term relationship going, payment up front is one of the better mechanisms of achieving that. Number 9, are you and your investors, your employees and your family prepared to make a long-term commitment to exporting? It's probably not the right time now during COVID because none of us are allowed to travel, but one of the most common things that exporters will do is travel to the overseas market. You need to go there for a variety of reasons. Number 1, to just go and see the place, to feel the place, to see who your competitors are, to understand how your competitors package their products, to understand how their supermarkets work, to understand how their distribution chains work, how their cold storage works. So you need to go over and wear out your shoe leather, figuring out how that market works and if that market's suitable for you. And then once you've done that, once you've met a potential distributor or a potential buyer, you also need to go over and create that relationship. If that relationship's mutually beneficial for both of you, and you can only really achieve that through many conversations and building that long-term relationship, then you'll know if it's going to be a success. And number 10 is to have an export plan with defined goals and strategies. And that brings us all the way back to ANSOS and that description of what strategies we're going to use in which markets, what's the budgets for those markets, what's the time frames, and how we're going to be able to afford it. So at the bottom of the card that I've provided you, it says if you said yes to 7 or more of these questions, you're probably ready to export now. If you score between 4 and 7, then you have good potential. But every one of those points needs to be expanded out more, and every one of those points will need a lot of thought and a lot of processing to get around it. I hope this has been helpful for you.
I think it's been enormously helpful, Gabby. I've just got a few questions to ask you. The first is...
Go for it, Terry. Thank you.
If someone's interested in exporting, how can you help them in that area, in your role?
Okay, absolutely. The first thing, again, that I would say is if someone's interested in exporting, I need to have an understanding of what their objectives are. I need to have an understanding of their business model, and I need to have an understanding of how prepared they are to go down that export journey. Once we've got that understanding, and I have got that understanding from them, I would put them through AusTrade's International Readiness Indicator, which is a free online tool that they can use. It's AusTrade's International Readiness Indicator. It takes about 5 minutes and it's got 12 questions, more or less the same questions we just went through, and it will spit you out a report at the end. It's all free and it's all online, and it will identify those areas where you do need to put a little bit more work into it. So once we've done that and we understand where more work needs to be done, I can assist you or guide you through that process. You're going to have to do all the work yourself because I obviously don't have access to your business records, but I can certainly guide you and give you some tools and some other guidelines, templates, anything like that that might help you along that process once you identify what you need to strengthen.
That's so good. And how about, Gabby, are there grants and funding that can support people to get export ready?
There is a few grants. So one of the criteria you would need to have is an Australian ABN number. For a business to access Australian government services, they have to be registered for an ABN. So that's fairly fundamental. The second criteria that they would need to have is what, is called a net benefit test to Australia. So there has to be a net benefit to prove that the product's coming, or the profits are coming back, or the service tourism dollars, education tourism dollars are coming back to benefit Australia. So that's another criteria. There is the Export Market Development Grant, and that's about the only Australian grant that is applicable for Australian businesses who are exporting their products and promoting their products. And if anyone got to that point, I'd be more than happy to explain that in great detail, or you can certainly Google it.
And when, Gabby, you mentioned before the quantities and the manufacturing processes that may be required to even consider exporting to start with. If somebody had a business that, for example, sold a niche but a high-end cosmetic or a food product, which we hear is something that a Chinese market might be interested in, for example. Is it worthwhile exploring that market if the production isn't on a massive scale?
That is a really good question, Kerry. The answer is yes and no. It's going to depend entirely on the product. So if it is really high end, then even though China is a mammoth market, the actual market, once you drill down to the people who might actually purchase it in one particular city, in one particular part, it might be relevant. Otherwise, I would recommend you went somewhere easier like New Zealand or Singapore or Taiwan or Hong Kong. It really depends on the product.
And if somebody was just in that stage of thinking that they might want to export but don't even know where to start, don't know what different countries might even be looking at, where would they start that search?
Have a conversation with myself. Another good way, and one thing I always ask people is, have you had any hits on the internet? What countries have come to you asking, do you have a distributor? What markets do you typically see coming to you? That's a good indicator.
Absolutely. And just for those of you who are listening, if you haven't set up Google Analytics, or you're not following the analytics of your Facebook or LinkedIn, that's something that you really should look into having done. We can make a webinar on that in the future as well, how to do that. So if you're following the traffic that's coming to your website, that will give you a bit of a clue. And as Gabby said, you can discuss those ideas with her as well. And
another method, of course, is e-commerce, which is growing exponentially, again, particularly with the situation that it is.
That commitment that people really need to be committed to export, as opposed to just dabbling in it and then walking away. Is that, I mean, obviously there's a lot of process involved in getting started. Is that the reason why you're honing in on the commitment, or are there other reasons as well?
Yeah, all of the things that you just mentioned. It's one of the real indicators of a successful exporter, or a successful business for that matter. But it is truly about that commitment. When the going gets tough, you have to have someone who will be a champion of the product and a champion of the business to keep pushing through.
Yeah. Absolutely. Oh, Gabby, that's been so helpful. And for those of you who are listening, I will share Gabby's details as well, so you can get in touch. And you can also see on your screen now the austrade.gov.au website. So that's another site where you can go to get information. And also, as Gabby mentioned before, that AusTrade International Readiness Indicator, so you can have a look if your business is appropriate in that. Any parting comments, Gabby?
No, I wish you well. Businesses who do export tend to pay their staff higher. They tend to last longer in the marketplace, and they create a community around them of support and supply that make their whole community better. So it's a very exciting process, and I'd be only too happy to help you through it.
Thank you so much.
That's okay, Kerry.